Hello, Peter4789 here, and welcome to my first impressions on Square Enix's working title, Project Triangle Strategy, a working title that was showcased in the Nintendo Direct that broadcasted around February 17th, with the release date for this game being at the earliest 2022. But despite this game still being worked on, Square Enix still managed to be able to release a debut demo for this title, like they did with Octopath Traveler when that game first got showcased. So what is Project Triangle Strategy then? Well, in a nutshell, I would say it's a strategy RPG that is heavily influenced by Final Fantasy Tactics and Tactics Ogre, with it using the beautiful HD 2D engine that was used in Octopath Traveler as a foundation for the game. The latter is pretty obvious to discern just from looking at the game visually, but the Final Fantasy Tactics and Tactics Ogre influence is definitely prominent when you play through the demo. The combat mechanics, the different classes and how each class have their own variety of unique abilities they can use, how both attack and movement are their own unique individual actions that a character can take, and how at the end of your character turn, you decide what direction your character faces, how there's a height system, the story giving off this political intrigue vibe to it, as you see not only how the main characters react to the Aifrost invasion, but also how the major houses of Glenberg and its neighbors respond and how they have their own machinations, how there's choices to be made in the debut demo, well one, but it's a choice that branches the story into two different paths. It gets you to fight two vastly different battles at the end of those paths. So it's pretty apparent that there is a strong Final Fantasy Tactics and Tactics Ogre influence in this debut demo, which is good I think, since we haven't had that type of SRPG for quite some time I think. And luckily there is still plenty of stuff unique to Triangle Strategy that makes it still its own thing. But I guess I should talk about what I like and what I think needs improvement in the demo itself. I guess the first thing to talk about is the overall presentation. Overall, I think it looks pretty good. The 2D sprites are charming, the backgrounds are well detailed for what they are, and the overall environmental design in general I think is well done for what little we see in this game setting. The character design also look pretty cool, and I do like how during cutscenes, you can pull up their profile and they show that particular character design as an aside. Like I said before, this game is more than likely using the engine used in Octopath Traveler as a foundation, so if you like the visual style from Octopath, I would say you probably like it here. That's how I feel at least. The most impressive visual spectacle in the debut demo though is probably the special effects used in spells, or even from the fire effect you see when you activate the fire trap in one of the battles. It's especially cool to see the spell effects leave a mark on the environment, like when you're casting an ice spell and see how the ground now have a sheet of ice on it as a result of that spell. I think the most impressive effect to me is the fire effect from the fire trap, with you not only seeing the buildings being set in flame, but also seeing that there are flame particles that now litter the screen as you progress through the battle. It's really cool. As for the other aspects of the presentation, I think the music sounds fantastic, the voice acting is pretty okay for the most part, and I think the story cutscenes looks fine. As for things I think needs definite improvement in the presentation, well I think the thing that stands out the most is probably the voice acting for the main character, Sirona. That is to say, I think his voice is pretty lackluster, or rather the direction of it. I actually don't have much issue with his voice in terms of how he sounds, but it does feel like he was directed to simply read his lines from the script without much emotion. This part was especially noticeable in the story when Sirona went to visit his bedridden father. AKA that scene was also kind of a nice throwback to Final Fantasy Tactics, so I like that, but I digressed. I think the voice direction behind Sirona was pretty lacking overall. Another thing I think will be a good quality of life element to add is probably auto read. Having character portraits would also be really nice in this game. I know Octopath Traveler didn't have them, but most of the character stories in Octopath, from what I've played, have had relatively focused stories that didn't have too many characters in each storyline, and it also wasn't generally too complicated. But I don't think this will be the case with this game. I mean, we already have 8 characters in our party, with that number likely rising in the main game, a good amount of antagonists or self-affiliated characters, and the plot will probably grow a lot more complicated as the game goes on. I'm just saying that having a consistent face connected with the sprites and voice in the cutscenes will go a long way in making the large cast of characters that's probably going to be in the main game to be more digestible and memorable for most people. It will be a lot of work, I can imagine, but I think it'll be worth it. Now, you might think pulling up the profile during the cutscenes would help in this regard, and I do think it's nice to be able to do that. But ultimately, I do think having character portraits alongside the text box would be the best solution, since pulling up the profile when a different character talks would break the flow of the cutscenes a lot. So please add character portraits, Square Enix. As for the story, I don't think I can comment much on it, since it's only 2 chapters. It's not even strictly the first 2 chapters of the game, technically. The debut demo starts at chapter 6 and 7, where shit gets real, and the Aifrost invades Glenbrook. But I will say I like what I saw. I think the game did a pretty good job in establishing the continent of Nozelia and the history between the 3 nations that resides within it. It was cool to see the perspective of the other 2 great houses of Glenbrook, as well as other parties, and see how they react to both the Aifrost invasion, as well as the decision that Sirona and Gen makes in either protecting Roland or turning him in. And the story overall does seem interesting as you follow Sirona and his party and see how they deal with the Aifrost army. I also like how your party members seem to play a big part in the choice system in this game, with you not only hearing each character's input on the situation and seeing what side of the fence they are on in this particular impasse, but also with how you can persuade them into your side. I think that's incredibly cool and make each character feel like their own being. But that's essentially what I can say about the story and plot. Not much to go on, but hey, this is just a debut demo and it just showcased 2 chapters in it. But what I have seen does get me intrigued. As for the gameplay, I'm pretty psyched from what I've seen in the demo. Like I said, the gameplay found in Project Triangle Strategy is very reminiscent of Final Fantasy Tactics and Tactics Ogre. The turn system, how height matters, how each character has a movement and action phase when it's their individual turn, how each character got a variety of actions to do, and so on. And those parts are good, and it's refreshing to have a Final Fantasy Tactics/Tactics Ogre style SRPG. But luckily, Triangle Strategy has its own mechanics that differentiate it. Mechanics that enhance the experience to boot. The first of which I talk about is probably the game's structure. Now the game's structure is almost the same as most other SRPGs, with the game getting you to watch cutscenes and then partake in battle to progress the game. But there is one key addition added to that formula, namely the exploration segments. Now these segments are what they sound like, instances where you're able to control your main character and be able to move about and interact within the environment. It's here where you'll be able to talk to your allies and hear the input on the current situation, which I like since it gives good character building. Heck, you can even have dialogue choices with some characters, which build up what I think are the 3 alignment choices you have, which are namely morality, liberty, and utility. I'm just guessing since the game is not really clear on this, but still cool. Now this sounds neat already, but I think the game uses these exploration segments in 2 interesting ways in the demo. The first is having an exploration segment before a battle, and the second is putting one right before a major choice is made in the game's story, and implementing that exploration segment into the choice making itself. So how is the exploration segment interesting in the first point? You're just moving about before the battle begins and talking to people. So how is that interesting in a gameplay point of view besides the alignment thing? Easy. Through your own exploration within this phase, you can affect tangible gameplay elements within the battle that is to come. Now this is seen pretty much only in the second battle of the game if you choose to turn Roland in, but before that second battle, you can actually fix a broken contraption that allows you to propel your characters from lower ground to pretty much where the boss is, from near the starting position, and that really changes a lot in how you can progress through the battle. Now it isn't entirely a boon since if you use that contraption for your allies, you still have to deal with the enemy mobs that are positioned in the highest elevation, and the enemy density up there is pretty substantial. But at least if you use it, you don't have to deal with the slow climb getting up the hill while you're getting bombarded with arrows with archers whom you can't even counterattack because they're at a higher elevation. That and you can deal with archers more quickly if you use the contraption. It's not the safer way, but it is the more aggressive way, with you also not having to deal with the enemy mages right away. And I think this is really smart of the game to do. It's giving you another option to progress through the map, why not railroading you to simply follow this new option you just discovered? It's simply a new option for you to contemplate that has its own pros and cons. And I really like that. It makes the battle much more interesting to strategize through. I also love how you have to unlock this new gameplay addition to the map through your own exploration of the instance. It just feels extremely satisfying to unlock. I guess this point just now is the main point I wanted to convey when I talked about what made the exploration segment before a battle interesting, but I kinda got carried away in explaining why this new option works so well, and why it's interesting options to unlock. But I digress. All in all, I really like how you can unlock additional options in battle through these exploration segments. It was already cool enough how you can run around and explore the battlefield before the battle begins and talk to people, but this feature makes the exploration part of the segment feel even more satisfying and make these segments feel more integrated into the gameplay itself. What with how you can affect what happens in the battle section of the game through what you do in these exploration segments. So that's the first interesting way in how the game uses these exploration segments. But the second and more intriguing way in how the game implements these exploration segments is how they integrate it into the choice making system that the game uses. Now, like Tactics Ogre, Triangle Strategy does look like it's going to have branching story paths. Heck, you can even see it in action when the game gets you to decide to either protect Roland or turn him into the Afrost. But rather than using the standard video game system that determines what story branch you take, you know, the bit where the game gets you to choose what path to take via a dialogue choice, Triangle Strategy actually gets you to choose what path you take via voting. That's right, rather than just letting your main character decide on what decision to make, your whole party actually votes on what decision they think is best for the group, and the side that gets the most votes wins. Now you do have the ability to try to convince your party members to pick a particular side, and that's actually the main thing you try to do in these type of exploration segments, to gather information around town and then try to convince your party members to vote in the decision you want to make, either by utilizing the information you got or just picking the right dialogue choices. But ultimately, the main factor that determines what story path you're taking is namely in how the voting goes, and I really like this aspect of the demo. It's an incredibly unique and interesting way to make a choice in the game. I can't really think of a similar system used in the game before. Not only is it unique, I like how it adds world and character building, in terms of how, through your information gathering, you'll be able to discern how various common citizens feel about the current situation, which is pretty cool I think. I especially love how your party members' input is key to the decision making in the game. It makes them feel like they're their own individual. Not to mention, it is interesting to hear their thoughts on the situation and see where they stand on the current issue that's happening in the story. Gameplay wise, I think this segment is interesting to do in the same way how the other exploration segments are, in regards to how your own exploration of these instances can dramatically affect the gameplay segments that precede these bits. For this case, it's the decision making, with it being pretty cool to gather the right information and saying the right dialogue choices to convince a party member to choose the choice you want to make at a particular juncture. It also helps that, like Tactics Ogre, Triangle Strategy story paths are dramatically different from each other, which overall make the choice making to feel impactful. Well, at least it seems that way so far in the demo. So suffice to say, I'm a pretty big fan of the exploration segments seen in the demo. But I guess I should talk more about the actual combat in Triangle Strategy, and what I think stands out in it. Firstly, I like how attacking an opponent backside is an automatic crit. I think it's a great incentive for getting behind the enemy, and it feels great to land that crit due to how you got it thanks to how you position your unit in relation to the enemy. I overall really like how this mechanic rewards you for advantageous maneuvering, while also at the same time gets you to be wary of how you're positioning your own units, since the enemy can do the same to you, which in turn gets you to make sure where you put your units on the field, as well as get you to pay close attention to what direction you want your units to face at the end of their turn. Now, Final Fantasy Tactics and Tactics Ogre also had a system in place that rewards you for hitting an opponent back or flank via your attack being more accurate, and this system is also in place in this game, but I think the bonus of an automatic back crit gets you to think more on how you're positioning your units around your enemies due to how much more damaging a back attack is in this game, for both you and your opponent. So that's the first thing I like. The second mechanic I think is interesting is that you have co-op attack called follow-up attacks in triangle strategy. How it works is that if you got units positioned from the front and back of an enemy or from both flanks, the unit that attack will gain assistance from the allied units. But note that only works if your allied units are positioned either from both flanks or from the front and back. Note that you can't get a follow-up attack if you're attacking an enemy from the front and your allied unit is positioned from their flank. I overall think it's a neat mechanic that prompts synergy between your units, as well as getting you to think on how to smartly position your units, since like back attacks, it's a mechanic that can be done to you by the enemy if you're careless, and it can cause a lot of damage when used right. Thirdly, I think the class balance in the demo is pretty good so far, with a few exceptions, but overall it's still pretty good. Each character falls in their own niche and each have their own strengths and weaknesses. Serona is your typical fighter on foot, with him boosting all around good stats, as well as having a few offensive skills, one of which is a pretty cool Dragoon jump that does a good deal of damage if you have enough TP. Roland, like Serona, is also a frontline fighter, though he has a lance and is mounted, which allows him to have a lot of movement and let him attack enemies 2 squares away from him, which overall makes him a very maneuverable character to utilize. His skill set is also interesting as he has skills that allows him to utilize a lot of movement, such as Rush, and a skill that allows him to attack twice with his lance, but he has to be adjacent to them. Benedict is pretty much a buffer, with him being able to strengthen a character's offensive or defensive capabilities, and he's even able to allow a unit to have a turn right after him. Gala is your healer with a haste spell. Fadrika and Corian are mages who are able to deal elemental spells that can damage multiple enemies if they are bunched up. They also each specialize in different elementals, which is significant to note since some enemies are weak to certain elements in the demo. Not to mention that each also have a unique utility spell that makes them useful in different situations, such as Quarantine having a spell that allows him to create an obstacle, or Fadrika being able to conjure a fire ward spell that lessens fire damage. Eredor is pretty much a shooter class, with him being your designated tank who has skills that revolve around crowd control via provoking enemies or having skills that allows him to knock enemies back. Hiwet, I think that's how you pronounce her name, is an archer that is mounted on a flying griffin, which allows her to have the most movement and range out of all the cast, which allows you to shoot pot shots at various enemies from safe locations, as well as debilitate them with Hiwet's debuff attacks. Then you got the optional characters you can recruit, with you getting one that gives you TP, one that's able to change the weather. I think there's a third optional character too, but I haven't managed to get her in my playthrough of the demo, so I don't really know much about them. The most fun character for me to use though is probably Anna, who is a spy. Now, she's not the strongest character by herself, but her ability to remain cloaked on the battlefield and to be able to do double actions makes her an incredibly powerful and fun character to use, I feel. The former allows her to not be hit as often by the enemies, which is already useful, but I think her ability to do double actions is incredibly useful and powerful. For one, being able to do 2 actions in one turn is pretty nifty, with her being able to do various abilities back to back, which is pretty good. Secondly, she can use 2 items in her turn, which is a pretty powerful option to have. Thirdly, she's really the only character who's able to do 2 follow-up attacks in her one turn. Being able to do 2 follow-up attacks in one turn is just insane due to how much damage you can dish out in that one turn if you know what you're doing. Like, for example, positioning one of your heavy hitters at the back of an enemy, and then you attacking them from the front with Anna, and then you seeing big numbers goes by as Anna attacked twice, with your allies being able to do 2 follow-up attacks due to how she can attack twice. Granted, she's not physically doing the most damage in this exchange, but this is something only Anna can do, which makes her pretty much one of the most powerful units to utilize in the demo. She's also the most fun due to how you have to think on how to utilize her, since she does require setup to take advantage of her ability to have her allies do 2 follow-up attacks in her turn, as well as how she's kind of frail. Suffice to say, I think the game does a really good job of making each character feel very distinctive from each other, with each being pretty fun to use due to how each character fills a niche that is tailored specifically for them. It makes strategizing with them and thinking of ways in how to synergize with them to be a lot of fun. The level design is also decent, I think. Now, if the maps stayed the same in the main release, I would probably think the maps are pretty underwhelming, especially the first battle since it's basically a linear pathway, with a few enemies thrown in without anything interesting happening, and this is supposed to be chapter 6 of the game. But I think they designed the maps as a showcase for Project Triangle Strategy, and for that purpose, I think the maps are fine. At least I'm hopeful that this is the case. Now the first battle, like I said, is pretty simple, but I think both versions of the second battle are interesting maps. I do like how they're inverse of each other, with one being like a defensive-like map, where you have terrain advantage and it prompting you to use the clear choke points you have to funnel your enemies into, and the others where you position as the aggressor and where you have to tackle through the enemy elevated defensive formations. They also have interesting environmental triggers, with one map prompting you to lure a slew of enemies into certain points in the map, so you can activate a trap to burn those troops to death, while the other map has lifts you can use to travel to specific elevated points in the map. I wouldn't say they're great maps, but they are pretty decent to good. Well, that's what I like about the overall gameplay in the debut demo for Project Triangle Strategy, but there are some things I think needs improvement. 1. The overworld map cursor movement is a bit too slow, speed that up. 2. The camera speed in battle is also a bit too slow, speed that up too please. 3. I would appreciate it if you can highlight specific enemy movement on the map. It's neat that when you move a unit, you can see the danger squares within your movement range, but it would be great if you were able to highlight specific enemies so you can see which specific enemies is going to hit you if you move into their movement range while you're deciding movement. 4. I think mage characters needs a bit of adjustment with how the TP system works. Now I casually talked about TP earlier, but to give you guys more of an idea of what it essentially works like an MP system with each character's ability costing a set amount of TP. With the stronger the abilities are, the more TP they cost. You also gain 1 TP each turn. Now this isn't much of a problem for the physical fighters since normal attacks cost 0 TP, and their normal attacks still deal decent damage. More so it utilize back attacks and follow-up attacks. Abilities costing TP and you generating 1 TP per turn is also fair. I do think there's merit to having a system like this, and having a system that gets you to think more on your resource management, in thinking when is the best time to use your TP to pull off powerful abilities in battle, and when is the best time to save and build up TP for future turns, and simply normal attack or even wait. There is some interesting strategic decision making to be made with this system. It also makes each ability to feel special since you do have to build up to it. Now the problem with mages in this game is that they don't have any worthwhile attacks that cost 0 or even 1 TP. You literally can't do anything except cast utility spells at the start, and even then you have to build up 2 TP afterwards to cast an offensive spell. So what you're doing for a decent amount of time as mages is simply waiting. Now this wouldn't be a problem if they hit like a truck when they can cast their offensive spells, especially since they cost 2 TP, but frankly speaking, I don't think they hit all that hard. I do think it's nifty how they can target groups, but their damage needs to be buffed, because as is, you're simply waiting to cast spells that deals okay damage to a group of enemies. The downtime isn't interesting since all you can do is wait, unlike the physical fighters, where they can do normal attacks and have ways to deal good damage with their physical attacks via good position and co-op attacks. And the reward for all that waiting also kind of feels underwhelming, since the damage is just okay. Yeah, that's my thoughts on mages in the demo. Well, just the offensive mages, since I don't think Gila falls into this category, since she does have a good spell that costs 1 TP, that is a single target heal. Now her group heal costs 2 TP, but I do think there is some interesting decision making to be had in deciding if you want to use a TP right now to simply heal one character, or wait so you can group heal at a later turn. It's interesting due to how she can do her main role at 1 TP, but there is incentive to build up TP to deal more powerful heal abilities down the road. I don't feel this is the case with Frederica and Cordian. They can't be offensive mages at 1 TP, and the damage they deal when they can cast do feel underwhelming. So I do think they do need some buff of some kind. Oh yeah, also give them 5 movement please. Mages only having 4 movement really hurts them, I feel. The movement is okay for the defensive chapter, where you can wait for the enemies to come to you, but having 4 movement when you're advancing on an enemy sucks so much. Now, I might be missing something in regards to the offensive mages. It's certainly possible, since I've only played through the demo once. But this is my current assessment on the offensive mages, aka Frederica and Cordian, at least for the moment. But I think that's all the major things I wanted to talk about in regards to elements I want improved in the main release. Overall, I would say I'm pretty hyped about Project Triangle Strategy. From what I've experienced, there are certainly some areas that needs definite improvement, but the foundation that is shown in this demo is incredibly promising. The presentation overall is good, the scale of conviction/voting mechanics is an incredibly intriguing and unique mechanic, and the overall SRPG gameplay that is there is a lot of fun, with it being pretty cool how it's a Final Fantasy Tactics and Tactics Ogre style SRPG that also has its own fair share of interesting mechanics. Well, that's my overall thoughts on Project Triangle Strategy's debut demo. Hope you guys enjoyed it, and if you guys have played the demo, I'd be interested to hear what your thoughts on it are.